The first thing you feel is the coarse texture of the rope against your neck. It is not tight enough to choke, but it is a constant, abrasive presence, a reminder of the beast of burden you are being made to resemble. The air is thick with the smells of the market, damp earth, wet straw, the sharp ammonia of livestock, and the heavy, sweet scent of cheap ale spilling from the public house door. You keep your eyes fixed on the muddy cobblestones, tracing the cracks to avoid lutter faces, but you can hear them. A low murmur ripples through the crowd, punctuated by a sharp laugh here, a scornful jeer there. Most are just curious onlookers, their daily errands interrupted by this rare piece of public theatre. Your husband's hand is a firm, sweating weight on your shoulder, propelling you forward towards the market cross, the traditional heart of this public space where all manner of goods are bought, sold, and traded. Today, that includes you, nor a figure of political importance. You are an ordinary woman in 18th century England, and this is your divorce. The sensation of public humiliation, of being reduced to property, was a tangible reality for some women of the English labouring classes. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. In the comments below, we invite you to share your thoughts on who you believe is the most misunderstood figure in history. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. The act itself was a stark and unambiguous piece of street theatre. It most often occurred in the most public of venues, the town market, the entrance to a local inn, or a village green. These were the centres of community life, the stages upon which the daily transactions of social were performed. The selection of such a location was not accidental. It was fundamental to the purpose of the ritual. For the sale to be considered valid in the court of public opinion, the only court that mattered for the participants, it had to be witnessed. The community had to see the transfer take place. The central artifact of this ritual was the halter. Typically made of rope or sometimes leather, it was placed around the wife's neck, arm, or waist. Its symbolism was impossible to miss, as it was the same device used to lead cattle, sheep, and horses to auction. This was not necessarily an act of pure malice, though it was undeniably degrading. It was a visual shorthand, a clear and public declaration that the woman was being treated, for the purposes of a specific transaction, as a piece of chattel. This act transformed her, in a legal and social fiction, into a movable good that could be disposed of. The husband would then lead his wife to the designated point of sale, often followed by a small procession of curious neighbors and children. Upon arrival, a public announcement was made. A town crier might be employed for a small fee, or the husband himself would proclaim his intentions in a loud voice. The wording varied, but the substance was consistent. He would declare the woman to be his wife, often enumerating her of a fine and handsome appearance as an auctioneer might praise his wares. He would then state his intention to sell her to the highest bidder, thereby absolving himself of all future marital responsibilities, including, most critically, her debts. However, the term auction is often misleading. While some sales involve competitive bidding, the vast majority were prearranged. The buyer was typically a man with whom the wife had already formed a new relationship. The auction was merely the public formalization of this new arrangement. The price was consequently symbolic, a token amount to make the transaction appear legitimate. A wife might be sold for a few shillings, a gallon of ale, or sometimes for a token sum as low as a single penny. The payment was not for the person, but for the transfer of obligation. Once the price was paid, the halter was handed from the husband to the buyer, and the deal was sealed. The new couple would walk away. The old husband would often retreat to the inn to spend the proceeds, and the crowd would disperse. The spectacle concluded. To the modern observer, it is an act of unimaginable cruelty. To many who participated unwitnessed it, it was simply a practical, if unseemly, solution to an impossible problem. To understand the logic, however brutal, that led a man to the market cross, one must first dismantle the modern conception of marriage as a romantic union and replace it with the predominant reality of the 18th and 19th centuries. For the vast majority of the English population, the agricultural labourers, The factory hands, the miners, and the artisans' marriage was fundamentally an economic partnership. It was a strategic alliance for survival, a pooling of resources and labor to form a viable household unit. The choice of a partner was often guided by practical considerations. A man sought a woman who was strong, healthy, and capable of managing a household, while a woman looked for a man with a steady trade or access to work, someone who could provide a reliable, if meager, income. Affection might grow within this structure, but the structure itself was built on a foundation of economic necessity. Within this household economy, the division of labor was stark and essential. The husband was typically the primary wage earner, his labor performed outside the home in exchange for coin. The wife's domain was the domestic sphere, but this was far from a place of leisure. Her labor was relentless and economically vital. She was responsible for transforming the raw wages of her husband into a livable existence, cooking meals, mending clothes, raising children, maintaining the dwelling, and tending to any small garden or livestock. Furthermore, many women were expected to supplement the family income through means compatible with their domestic duties, such as taking in laundry, doing piecework from local factories, or selling small goods like eggs or beer. The household functioned like a small, interdependent business. If one partner failed to perform their duties, the entire enterprise was threatened with collapse. The breakdown of this partnership was therefore not merely an emotional crisis. It was an economic catastrophe. An irreparable conflict within the marriage meant the fundamental mechanism for survival had ceased to function. This failure could stem from numerous sources. A husband's descent into alcoholism could divert his entire wage to the public house, leaving the family destitute. A wife's inability or refusal to manage the home efficiently could lead to squalor and debt. The introduction of a third party, domestic violence, or a simple, intractable clash of personalities, impossible and cooperation cease. In such a state, the house was no longer a home but a prison, shared by two individuals whose union had become a source of mutual destruction rather than mutual support. For those trapped in such a union, there were no simple exits. A woman could not just pack a bag and leave. To whom would she go? Her parents, if still alive, were likely poor themselves and unable to support an additional mouth. Without a husband, she had little to no legal standing and few opportunities for independent survival beyond grueling, low-wage service, or the parish poorhouse. For a woman with children, the prospect was even bleaker. A husband, likewise, could not simply order his wife out of the house. English law, under the doctrine of sever, held that a husband was legally responsible for the support and maintenance of his wife. This included providing her with food, shelter, and clothing. More perilously for him, he was also legally responsible for any debt she incurred. If she left him, or even if they lived separately, any credit she obtained from local merchants for necessities would be his liability. This legal obligation created a powerful incentive for the husband to seek a definitive and publicly witnessed end to the relationship, one that would serve as a notice to the entire community that his financial responsibility for the woman had been terminated. The unworkable marriage was thus an inescapable one, a bond that, once broken in spirit, remained legally and financially shackled, slowly strangling both parties within its confines. The existence of a custom as jarring as wife selling immediately provokes a fundamental question. Why was there no formal, state-sanctioned alternative? If a marriage had demonstrably failed, plunging a household into misery and economic ruin, why did the legal apparatus of the English state not provide a structured and humane path to dissolution? The answer lies in the stark reality that in the 18th and early 19th centuries, England did not have a single, unified legal system for all its subjects. Instead, it operated what was, in effect, a two-tiered system of justice, particularly in the realm of matrimony. One system was designed for the wealthy, the landed, and the politically connected. The other system, for the vast majority of the population, was one of neglect. The law of the land was not a public utility, but a private luxury. For the elite, a pathway to complete divorce, known as a divorce of vincula matrimoniae, did exist. It was, however, an arduous, scandalously public, and breathtakingly expensive process, available only through a private act of Parliament. This was not a simple court filing, it was an act of sovereign legislation, requiring the consent of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and finally royal assent. To even begin this process, a petitioner, almost invariably a husband, had to first satisfy the requirements of two other court systems. The first step was to obtain a legal separation from the ecclesiastical courts, the church-run bodies that held jurisdiction over marital matters. Here, a husband had to prove his wife's adultery. This required witnesses, evidence, and costly legal representation. If successful, the court would grant a divorce immense et thoro, which formalized their separation but critically did not permit either party to remarry. The marriage bond, in the eyes of the church, was indissoluble. The second, and often more humiliating, step was to sue his wife's lover in the civil courts in an action known as criminal compensation. This lawsuit was not technically about the divorce, but about financial compensation. Under the legal fiction of coverture, a wife was considered her husband's property, and her infidelity was framed as a form of property damage. The husband sued the other man for trespassing on his property and sought monetary damages for the loss of his wife's consortium and the potential corruption of his bloodline. These trials were often sordid, sensational affairs, with intimate details of the marriage laid bare and reported gleefully in the press. Only upon winning both of these prior legal battles could a man take the final step of petitioning Parliament. This final stage involved hiring parliamentary agents, paying clerks, and covering enormous administrative fees as the private bill made its slow journey into law. The total cost for this three-stage process was astronomical, typically running into many hundreds, and sometimes thousands of pounds. To place this in context, an agricultural labourer's annual wage during this period might be between £20 and £50. A full parliamentary divorce could therefore cost more than 10 times the entire lifetime earnings of a working man. Furthermore, the process was almost exclusively a male prerogative. A wife seeking a divorce had to prove not just her husband's adultery, but adultery compounded by an aggravating factor such as incest, bigamy, or life-threatening cruelty, an almost impossible standard to meet. Between 1670 and 1857, fewer than 325 parliamentary divorces were granted in total, nearly all of them to wealthy, powerful men. For the labouring poor, who constituted the overwhelming majority of the English population, this entire legal universe was as remote and inaccessible as the surface of the moon. They lacked the money, the educations, the political connections, and the social standing to even contemplate initiating such a process. The state, in its legislative and judicial capacity, simply did not provide a mechanism for them to end a marriage. The high-minded jurisprudence surrounding property, inheritance, and bloodlines, the very issues that parliamentary divorce was designed to protect for the aristocracy, had no relevance to a family whose only assets were a few pieces of furniture and the clothes on their backs. This legal vacuum, this profound and deliberate institutional indifference, is the key to understanding the custom of wife selling. Denied any formal recourse by the state, the common people were forced to invent their own. Wife selling was not an act of ignorance against the law. It was a pragmatic creation in the absence of law. The abstract concept of a two-tiered legal system becomes concrete when examined through the lens of its costs. The impassable gulf between the wealthy and the poor was not merely one of social standing or political influence. It was meticulously quantified in pounds, shillings, and pence. To a labourer considering his options from within a miserable marriage, the path to a parliamentary divorce was not just difficult, it was a financial absurdity. A journey whose every step was paved with fees that exceeded his annual, and often lifetime income. Freedom from marriage was not a right, it was a commodity, and its price was set deliberately high to ensure it remained in the hands of the few. The financial bleed began at the very first stage, in the ecclesiastical courts. One could not simply walk into the court and state a grievance. The process was mediated by a specialized class of lawyers known as proctors, whose fees were the initial libel or statement of complaint incurred a fee. Summoning witnesses to testify, a necessity for proving adultery, cost money for each summons served. The court itself charged fees for every document copied, every motion filed, and every judgment recorded. For a man earning perhaps 15 shillings a week, the accumulation of these preliminary costs, potentially amounting to several pounds, was enough to render the entire process a non-starter. Should a petitioner possess the means to navigate the church courts, the second stage, the civil action for criminal compensation, presented a new and even more substantial financial hurdle. This required retaining a different set of legal professional solicitors to prepare the case and barristers to argue it in the common law court. Their fees were significantly higher than those of the proctors. Proving the act of adultery to the satisfaction of a jury often required hiring private investigators to gather evidence, a costly and sordid business. Witnesses might need to be paid for their time and travel. The potential reward in damages, which could be substantial in cases involving wealthy adulterers, was never guaranteed. More importantly, if the husband lost his case, he could be held liable for the legal costs of the defendant, plunging him into catastrophic debt. It was an enormous financial gamble, one that only a man of considerable means could afford to risk. The final and most expensive phase was the petition to Parliament. This was where the costs escalated from merely prohibitive to truly astronomical. The petitioner had to hire a parliamentary agent, a specialist lobbyist who understood the arcane procedures of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The agent's fees were substantial. The private bill itself had to be drafted by a lawyer, and every stage of its passage was accompanied by a house fee. Its second reading for the committee stage where evidence was heard, for its third reading, and then the entire process with its attendant fees was repeated in the other House of Parliament. The petitioner was required to pay for the bill to be printed and distributed to every member of Parliament. Witnesses who had already testified in the previous court cases often had to be brought to London at the petitioner's expense, covering their travel, lodging, and food to give evidence again before a parliamentary committee. According to historical analysis, the average cost of an uncontested parliamentary divorce in the early 19th century was rarely less than £600, and a contested one could easily exceed £1,000. When the annual wage of a skilled artisan was around £70 and that of an agricultural labourer was closer to £30, this sum represented an impossible fortune. It was the financial equivalent of a modern working-class person needing to raise tens of millions of dollars to end a marriage. The system was not merely broken for the poor, it was never built for them in the first place. Before the mid-18th century, the legal definition of marriage in England was characterized by a surprising degree of ambiguity and informality. While a public ceremony in a church was the socially approved method, it was not, in the eyes of the common law, the only one. A valid and binding marriage could be formed simply by the mutual consent of the parties, a principle inherited from older canon law, as spons olia per verbidi presenti. If a man and woman declared themselves husband and wife before witnesses, they were, for most legal purposes, married. This lack of centralized control created a chaotic landscape of marital arrangements, particularly in London. The area around the Fleet prison became notorious for clandestine marriages, performed on demand for a small fee by debt-ridden and often unscrupulous clergymen, without the need for bans or parental consent. This informal system offered a degree of flexibility. A union formed by a simple declaration might also be dissolved by a simple declaration, a mutual agreement to part ways that, while not legally recognized as a divorce, carried weight within a local community. This very flexibility, however, was a source of profound anxiety for the English aristocracy and the propertied classes. Their primary concerns were the orderly transfer of wealth and the preservation of bloodlines. An informal marriage system created endless opportunities for legal challenges to inheritance. A fortune hunter could entrap a young heiress in a secret ceremony, or a disinherited son could produce a previously unknown wife and children to lay claim to an estate. The potential for blackmail, bigamy, and contested wills was enormous. It was a system that threatened the very foundations of landed society. It was to remedy this specific, upper-class problem that Lord Chancellor Hardwicke introduced the Clandestine Marriages Act in 1753, a piece of legislation that would have profound and entirely unforeseen consequences for the nation's poor. The act was a sweeping reform designed to bring order and certainty to the institution of marriage. Its provisions were clear and uncompromising. Henceforth, for a marriage to be legally valid in England, it had to adhere to a strict set of procedures. The marriage must take place in a parish church of England. It had to be preceded by the public reading of banns on 3 consecutive Sundays, in the home parishes of both parties, or alternatively, by the purchase of a special license. The ceremony had to be conducted by an ordained Anglican clergyman and formally recorded in a husband marriage register, with the entry signed by the couple, the clergyman, and to witnesses. Any marriage that failed to meet these stringent requirements was declared legally null and void to all intents and purposes whatsoever. The act effectively shut down the trade of the free parsons overnight. For the aristocracy, the act achieved its goals perfectly. It made marriage a public and verifiable event, securing property and simplifying inheritance. But for the laboring poor, its effects were entirely different. The law that was intended to be a shield for the rich became a cage for the poor. By eradicating all forms of informal marriage, the act also eradicated all forms of informal separation. The state had now imposed a single, rigid definition of marriage. A union was no longer a fluid agreement that might exist in the eyes of the community. It was a formal, legally binding contract with the state, entered into a public record. The very act of formalizing the entrance to marriage made the absence of a formal exit all the more acute. Before 1753, a poor couple in an unworkable common law union might simply agree to go their separate ways. Lacking a formal record of their union, their separation could, over time, gain a degree of de facto acceptance. But after the act, their marriage was an undeniable registered fact. The husband's legal responsibility for his wife, especially her debts, was now formally unpermanently established. The act transformed marriage from a potentially ambiguous social state into an ironclad legal status. In doing so, it inadvertently strengthened the logic behind wife selling. If the state insisted on a public and formal entry into marriage, the people would invent their own public and formal exit. The ritual at the market cross, with its public proclamation and witnesses, became a grim parody of the very church ceremony the act had made mandatory, a folk legal divorce designed to undo a state-sanctioned marriage that the state itself refused to dissolve. Long before the state, as embodied by Parliament, took a decisive interest in the mechanics of marriage, jurisdiction over matrimonial causes in England lay almost exclusively with the church. Through a network of ecclesiastical courts, operating in parallel to the civil and criminal justice systems, the Church of England adjudicated on the spiritual and legal validity of marriages, separations, and other domestic disputes. Known by names such as the consistory courts in each diocese or the higher courts of arches and chancery, were not concerned with property law or criminal acts in the secular sense. Their mandate was rooted in canon law, and their primary objective was to uphold the sanctity of the marital sacrament. The core theological principle guiding their every decision was that a marriage, once validly contracted and consummated, was a lifelong covenant blessed by God, which no human institution had the authority to dissolve completely. For a couple trapped in an unbearable union, these church courts represented the only officially sanctioned avenue for seeking any form of legal relief. A husband or wife could bring a suit before the court, petitioning for a legal separation. However, the grounds upon which such a petition could be made were narrowly defined and difficult to prove. The most common and effective ground was adultery, if one party could provide compelling evidence and witness testimony of the other's infidelity. The court was likely to grant a separation. The second established ground was extreme cruelty, or SAEVTA. This was not a matter of mere unhappiness or verbal abuse. The petitioner had to demonstrate a pattern of physical violence so severe that it posed a genuine and persistent threat to their life and limb. A third, more complex ground was desertion. But this was often harder to litigate successfully. The process of bringing such a case was, in itself, a significant deterrent. It was a public and often humiliating affair. Witnesses had to be found and compelled to testify about deeply personal, unsensitive matters. Servants might be called to speak about what they had seen or heard in the marital home. Neighbors might be questioned about late-night visitors or public arguments. The evidence presented was often salacious and intimate, providing ample fodder for local gossip. Like all formal legal proceedings of the era, it was not free. It required the hiring of proctors, the specialized lawyers who practiced in these courts. Fees were charged for filing documents, for the time of the court officials, and for producing a final written decree, while the costs were a fraction of those required for a parliamentary divorce. They were still substantial enough to place the ecclesiastical courts well beyond the reach of the vast majority of the laboring population. Even for those who possessed the financial means and the stomach for such a public ordeal, the remedy offered by the church courts was profoundly unsatisfactory. If a case was proven, the court would not grant a divorce in the modern sense. It would not declare the marriage over. Instead, it would issue a decree of divorce mensa et thora, literally from bed and board. This was a legal, court-ordered separation. The couple was no longer required to live together, and the husband's obligation to cohabit with his wife was suspended. The court could also issue an order of alimony, requiring the husband to provide a regular sum for his wife's maintenance, though the enforcement of these payments was often inconsistent. The critical limitation of this decree, however, was that it did not sever the underlying marital bond, the vinculum matrimoniae. In the eyes of both the church and the state, the separated individuals were still husband and wife. The most significant consequence of this was that neither party was free to remarry. To do so while their estranged spouse was still alive would constitute the crime of bigamy, an offense that could be punished by imprisonment or transportation. The divorce mensa et thora did not offer a new beginning. It offered a state of permanent legal limbo. It could solve the immediate problem of a violent or unfaithful partner, but it left both individuals trapped in a defunct marriage, unable to move on and form a new, functional, and legitimate family unit. For the poor, whose very survival depended on the formation of a viable household partnership, this state of suspended animation was no solution at all. It simply replaced a private misery with a legally mandated loneliness. The legal state created by a decree of divorce mensa et thora was a peculiar and deeply frustrating form of suspended animation. It was a judicial acknowledgement that a marriage had failed in practice, while simultaneously insisting upon its continued existence in theory. This separation of bed and board addressed the most immediate physical symptoms of a failed union. It allowed the parties to live apart without being accused of desertion, but it left the underlying legal and spiritual bond, the vinculum matrimoniae, entirely intact. The couple was granted the freedom of physical distance, but not the freedom of a new life. For all the individuals involved, this half measure created a web of social, economic, and personal complications that, for many, was as untenable as the marriage they had just escaped. For a woman, the situation was particularly precarious. While the court might grant her alimony, this was by no means a guarantee of financial security. The amount was often a small fraction of her husband's income, barely enough for subsistence. More critically, the collection of these payments was notoriously difficult. A resentful husband might simply refuse to pay, move to another parish to avoid his obligations, or find his own income too precarious to consistently provide for a separate household. This left the separated woman in a constant state of financial uncertainty. She was unable to rely on her husband, yet her legal status as a married woman, operating under the principles of sever, restricted her ability to conduct business, enter into contracts, or acquire property in her own name. She was in essence an independent agent shackled by the legal identity of a dependent. The most profound restriction, however, was the prohibition on remarriage. A separated woman could not form a new, legally recognized union. This was not just a denial of the potential for future companionship, it was a denial of the primary path to economic stability and social legitimacy for a woman of her era. Any new relationship she formed would be extra-legal. If she cohabited in the eyes of the community and the church, any children born of this new union would be deemed illegitimate, stripped of the right to inherit and burdened with a powerful social stigma. The decree that had freed her from a bad husband had also condemned her to a life without a legitimate one. For the man, the state of legal separation was also deeply unsatisfactory. He too was barred from remarrying and founding a new family. For a man of property, this meant he could not produce a legitimate heir. For a man of the laboring class, it meant he could not acquire a new partner to manage his household, a role that was economically essential. The absence of a wife's labor, the cooking, cleaning, mending, and child care placed a significant burden on his own time and resources. Furthermore, the separation did not completely sever his financial obligations. In addition to any court-ordered alimony, the specter of his wife's debts remained. Under sever, a husband was responsible for his wife's necessaries. Even though they lived apart, a local shopkeeper could extend credit to his legally separated wife for food or clothing, and then sue the husband for payment. This lingering financial liability was a constant threat, a legal tie that could plunge him into debt at any moment due to the actions of a woman over whom he no longer had any domestic control. This legally mandated limbo was fundamentally incompatible with the survival strategies of the poor. Their world was not one of estates and inheritances, but of weekly wages and the constant struggle to maintain a functional household. The ecclesiastical court's solution offered them a life sentence of social and economic dysfunction. It created two incomplete households where there had once been one. It denied both parties the ability to form the very partnership that was the bedrock of their existence. It is in this context that the logic of the wife's sale becomes starkly clear. The ritual at the market cross was a direct rejection of the inadequate remedy offered by the official system. It was a folk legal performance designed to achieve a definitive and public conclusion. The transfer of the halter was not just about ending cohabitation. It was about the public transfer of all marital duties, including the crucial financial ones, and, most importantly, about freeing both parties to remarry and rebuild their lives within the community's eyes, regardless of what the distant courts in London might decree. The folk legal ritual of wife selling was, at its core, an act of public communication. Having been denied access to the private chambers of the ecclesiastical courts and the grand halls of Parliament, the labouring poor were compelled to create their own theatre of law. The efficacy of this invented ceremony depended entirely on its public nature. A private agreement to separate was worthless. It would not absolve a husband of his wife's future debts, nor would it grant social legitimacy to a new union. For the transfer of marital obligation to be considered binding in the eyes of the community, the only court that mattered it had to be performed openly, before a multitude of witnesses. The choice of venue was therefore not a matter of component of the ritual itself, selected to maximize visibility and imbue the act with a sense of finality and public record. The most common and symbolically potent stage for these transactions was the public market, whether a dedicated livestock auction or the general weekly market in a town square. This was a space already synonymous with commerce, transfer, and public valuation. By placing the wife sale within this context, the participants were deliberately framing the act in a language everyone understood. The presence of auctioneers, the cacophony of bidding, and the sight of goods changing hands created a powerful backdrop of legitimacy. The Smithfield Market in London, a sprawling and notorious hub for the cattle trade, is cited in several historical accounts as a location for wife sales. The choice of such a venue created an unavoidable and deliberate parallel between the woman being sold and the animals also being auctioned. The halter around her neck was not just a symbol, it was a piece of equipment native to that environment. This was the ritual in its rawest, most unsettling form, a public spectacle that leveraged the existing customs of agricultural commerce to dissolve a human bond. Almost as frequently, sales were conducted at the threshold of a public house or inn. The tavern was the undisputed center of social life for the working-class man and, to a lesser extent, his community. It was a place of news, gossip, business arrangements, and social sanction. Holding a sale on the steps of the local inn ensured that the news of the divorce would travel swiftly through the very social networks that needed to be informed. It served as a direct notice to local tradesmen that the husband was no longer liable for his former wife's credit. Furthermore, the transaction itself often involved alcohol. The price paid for the wife was frequently a token sum to be immediately spent on a gallon of ale for the husband, or sometimes a round of drinks for the key witnesses. The pub provided the physical location for this payment to be made and consumed, sealing the agreement in a communal, if grim act of beverage sharing. The transaction began undended in the social heart of the community. Beyond the specific venues of the market and the pub, sales often took place in any space that represented the civic heart of the community. The market cross, a stone monument found in the center of most English towns, was a traditional site for official proclamations and public announcements. By co-opting this space, participants were performing their folk legal ritual on the very ground typically reserved for the pronouncements of state and church authority. It was a subtle act of defiance, a claim that their community-sanctioned divorce was as valid as any decree read by a bailiff. Similarly, town squares, village greens, or even the parish stocks places of public punishment and assembly were used. Each location was chosen for its capacity to draw a crowd and its inherent status as a public forum. In a few documented cases, the locations were chosen for their liminal quality, their status points of transition. Sales were recorded as taking place at toll gates or on bridges that marked the boundary between two parishes. The symbolism here is potent. The act of selling the wife at a point of passage suggested a final, irreversible crossing over. The couple was not merely separating within the same community. They were formally severing their connection at a jurisdictional border, each now free to proceed into a new and separate existence. Regardless of the specific location, the underlying principle remained the same. The ritual had to be seen. The silence and privacy of the official court system were replaced by the noise and exposure of the public square, a necessary adaptation for a people whose only legal recourse was the collective memory and dissent of their neighbors. At the heart of the wife-selling ritual, both visually and thematically, was the halter. This simple object, a length of rope or a strap of leather fashioned into a crude harness, was the indispensable prop in this grim piece of public theatre. Its presence was recorded in the overwhelming majority of historical accounts, from newspaper reports to court records and eyewitness diaries. The halter was not merely an incidental detail, it was the central, unifying symbol of the entire transaction, a potent signifier that communicated the legal fiction being enacted in a way that words alone could not. Its symbolism operated on multiple, overlapping levels, conveying ideas of property, transfer, animal husbandry, and public subjugation. The most immediate and visceral meaning of the halter was its direct association with livestock. It was the standard tool used to lead animals, horses, cattle, sheep to market for sale. By placing this device around a woman's neck, arm, or waist, the ritual deliberately and shockingly reduced her, for the duration of the ceremony, to the status of an animal to be bought and sold. This was a piece of calculated degradation, but it was a degradation with a specific legalistic purpose. Under English common law, the wife was not chattel. She could not be legally sold. However, an animal could be. The halter was a visual device that momentarily transformed the woman into a legal category of property that could be transferred through a sale. It was a crude but effective piece of folk legal maneuvering, creating a symbolic loophole in a legal system that offered no other way out. The husband was not selling his wife, the human person. He was selling the creature at the end of the halter, a piece of movable property. This act of symbolic reclassification also served to publicly sever the marital bond. The halter acted as a physical representation of the husband's control and responsibility. In leading his wife to the market by this rope, he was demonstrating his possession, his legal authority over her one last time. The critical moment of the entire ritual was the transfer of the halter's end from the hand of the husband to the hand of the buyer. This was the precise instant of transfer. The simple act of passing the rope signified the complete and public handover of all marital rights and, more important, actions. The buyer, in accepting the halter, was accepting responsibility for the woman's future maintenance, conduct, and debts. The husband, in releasing it, was publicly abdicating those same responsibilities. The halter was the physical instrument of conveyance, the folk legal equivalent of a signed deed. Beyond its legalistic function, the halter was an instrument of profound public humiliation. It was an unambiguous mark of shame, a sign that the woman and her husband had failed so completely in their marital duties that they had resorted to this desperate and degrading public spectacle. The experience of being led through a crowd of jeering neighbors with a rope around one's neck was a form of social punishment, a public penance for a broken domestic union. This element of shaming was likely intentional. It discouraged frivolous use of the custom and underscored the gravity of the marital collapse. It was a clear signal to the community that this was not a casual affair, but a last resort born of profound misery. Interestingly, the material of the halter itself was sometimes noted in contemporary accounts. A simple rope halter was most common, befitting the poverty of the participants. However, some reports mention halters adorned with ribbons, a bizarre and poignant attempt to add a touch of ceremony or perhaps soften the grim reality of the act. In one particularly detailed case from 1815, a man named Henry Cook sold his wife in the Croydon market using a halter made of straw, a material with its own complex symbolic history associated with worthlessness and impermanence. The choice of material, the way it was worn, and the final act of its transfer were all carefully calibrated elements in a powerful, non-verbal language of social and legal meaning. The halter was the key that unlocked the ritual, transforming a domestic crisis into a public transaction and a human being into a temporary commodity for the sake of a freedom the state would not grant. With the woman now positioned at the designated point of sale, the halter serving as a clear and public signal of intent, the verbal component of the ritual would commence. The silence of the crowd, a mixture of anticipation, pity, and morbid curiosity, would be broken by a formal proclamation. This was the moment the private misery of a failed marriage was transmuted into a public legal proceeding, at least in the eyes of the community. The responsibility for making this announcement typically fell to one of three figures: the husband himself, a higher town crier, or a figure of informal authority, like a publican or a parish clerk. Each choice of orator carried its own nuance, but the fundamental objective was the same: to officiate the transfer in a manner that was loud, clear, and unambiguous. Most frequently, the husband acted as his own auctioneer. This was the most direct and, in many ways, the most poignant scenario. His voice, likely strained with a combination of shame, desperation, and perhaps grim resolve, would rise above the murmur of the market. This act of self-proclamation underscored the personal nature of the failure. It was his marriage, his debt, and his responsibility to dissolve it. However, for a fee, often a pint of ale, or a few pence, a man might employ the local town crier. This lent the proceedings of an era of quasi-officialdom. The crier, with his bell and his practiced, stentorian call of oise. Oise was a figure associated with legitimate civic announcements. Using him was an attempt to borrow the authority of the state for a custom that the state explicitly condemned, a subtle act of defiance that framed the folk ritual in the language of formal law. The content of the proclamation itself followed a surprisingly consistent formula, as reconstructed from numerous press reports and court testimonies. The speaker would first demand the attention of the assembled crowd. He would then introduce the woman, often by name, and state her relationship to him. "I bring to market my wife, Mary." What followed was the sales pitch, a portion of the speech that could range from the genuinely complimentary to the brutally sarcastic. In cases where the separation was relatively amicable or pre-arranged with a new partner, the husband might praise her virtues. She would be described as a good-tempered creature, a notable housewife, or well-skilled in the arts of domestic management. This was done to present the transaction as a reasonable transfer of a valuable, if misplaced, asset. In more acrimonious separations, however, this part of the speech became a final act of public denunciation. A husband might declare his wife to be a shrew, a drunkard, or a woman of loose morals. He might list her faults and failings, presenting the sale not as a transfer of value but as a riddance of a burden. In either case, whether praising or condemning, the proclamation almost invariably concluded with a critical legalistic statement. The husband would announce that he was selling her, along with all her faults, to the highest bidder. Crucially, he would declare that the sale would render him free from all her present and future debts, and that he would no longer be responsible for her maintenance. This was the core purpose of the entire public speech, to serve as a public notice to every merchant and creditor in the community that his financial liability for this woman was, from that moment forward, extinguished. The bidding was then declared open, often with a symbolic starting price, such as a single shilling or the price of a quart of gin. The public words had been spoken, the community had been put on notice. The verbal contract, in their eyes, was now in effect. The public proclamation, with its stark declaration of intent, naturally led to the final and most tangible element of the transaction: the price. To the modern mind, conditioned by concepts of market value and human rights, this is perhaps the most repellent aspect of the entire custom. The very idea of placing a monetary value on a human being is abhorrent. Yet, to interpret the price paid in a wife sale through a commercial lens is to fundamentally misunderstand the ritual's internal logic and purpose. The sums exchanged were rarely, if ever, a reflection of the woman's perceived worth, her skills, or her attributes. Instead, The price was a symbolic device, a crucial piece of legal theatre that served to concretize the transfer of obligation in a way that all witnesses could see and comprehend. An examination of documented cases reveals a staggering range of prices, a spectrum that itself argues against a commercial motive. The sums were often conspicuously, almost absurdly low. In one often cited case from 1733 in Birmingham, a man named Samuel Whitehouse sold his wife Mary to a Thomas Griffiths for the price of 1 guinea. In other instances, the price was far more modest. A few shillings was a common figure enough to stand a round of drinks, but hardly a life-changing sum. Joseph Thompson famously sold his wife for 50 shillings, a relatively high price that was still a mere fraction of the cost of even the initial stages of a formal divorce. More telling are the cases where the price was purely nominal. Wives were sold for a single shilling, sixpence, or in some extreme cases for a mere penny. The purpose of such a transaction was clearly not profit. Furthermore, the payment was often not made in legal tender at all. A significant number of sales were concluded in exchange for alcohol. A wife might be traded for a gallon of beer or a quart of gin. In these instances, the transaction often flowed seamlessly into a social ritual. The husband, the buyer, and sometimes a few key witnesses would immediately retire to the adjacent public house to consume the price, effectively sealing the deal with a shared, public drink. This act of communal consumption served as a form of social ratification. It was the folk legal equivalent of a toast, a handshake over a deal, or the wetting of a commission. The alcohol was not payment in a commercial sense. It was the libation that sanctified the end of one union and the beginning of another in the eyes of the community. The fiction of a competitive auction, implied by the husband's call for the highest bidder, was largely just that, a fiction. While a few sensationalized accounts described spirited bidding among several interested men, the vast majority of sales were prearranged affairs. The buyer was almost always the man with whom the wife had already formed a new relationship and intended to live. The public auction was therefore not a genuine exploration of market price, but a performance for the benefit of the community. The predetermined buyer would make his token bid, no one would challenge it, and the deal would be concluded. The exchange of a small sum of money or a pot of ale was the consideration that made the contract binding in the popular imagination. It was the physical proof that something of value, however small, had changed hands, thereby validating the transfer of the more abstract and significant commodity, marital responsibility. Thus, the price of a partner was not the price of the partner. It was the fee for a custom-made divorce. It was the nominal cost associated with staging the public ritual. The money might cover the hiring of the town crier, the cost of the halter, or most commonly, the celebratory or conciliatory drinks that followed. The husband's primary financial gain was not the pittance he received in his hand, but the immense future liability he had just shed. By accepting the token payment, he was publicly released from the legal obligation to house, feed and clothe his wife, and most critically, from the crushing weight of any debt she might accrue. The small coin or glass of gin was simply the symbolic seal on a far more significant financial deliverance. To view the husband in the wife's selling ritual solely as a perpetrator of cruelty is to apply a modern sensibility to a pre-modern dilemma. While the act was undeniably an assertion of patriarchal power, his position was often as desperate and constrained as his wife's, albeit in a different melodrama. He was not simply a villain in a domestic melodrama. He was a man trapped in the same rigid legal and economic structure, employing the only-to-love extrication his class had managed to devise. To understand his motivations requires setting aside moral indignation and instead examining the immense pressures, financial, social, and personal, that could drive a man to lead his wife to the market with a halter around her neck. The most powerful and frequently cited motivation was economic desperation, specifically the crushing burden of a husband's legal liability for his wife's debts. The doctrine of sever, which subsumed a wife's legal identity into her husband's, made him singularly responsible for her financial actions. For a man of the laboring poor, living perpetually on the edge of subsistence, this was not an abstract legal theory but a constant and terrifying threat. A wife who was a poor household manager, prone to extravagance, or who simply could not make ends meet on a meager allowance, could quickly accumulate significant debts with local shopkeepers, bakers, and alehousekeepers. These creditors, knowing the law was on their side, would not pursue the wife for payment. They would pursue the husband. This could lead to a catastrophic spiral. A man returning from a week of hard labor might find his entire wage immediately claimed by merchants to whom his wife owed money. If he could not pay, his tools or furniture could be seized. In the worst-case scenario, he could be arrested and thrown into a debtor's prison, a notoriously brutal and often lethal fate. Incarceration meant he could no longer work, plunging the entire family into complete destitution and reliance on the parish, which was itself a source of profound social shame. From this perspective, a wife who was an unmanageable financial liability was not just a domestic annoyance, she was a direct threat to his liberty and his family's survival. The wife's sale, in this context, became a radical and public act of financial severance. The husband's primary goal was not to profit from the sale, but to publicly declare his non-liability to the entire community of potential creditors. It was a form of folk bankruptcy, a desperate gambit to save himself from ruin. Beyond the stark calculus of debt, the husband's motivations were also rooted in the daily realities of a collapsed domestic partnership. Marriage was an economic unit that required the labor of both partners to function. If a wife, for reasons of acrimony, alcoholism, or infidelity, ceased to perform her domestic duties, the household would cease to function. The husband was left without cooked meals, mended clothes, or a managed home, conditions which directly impacted his own ability to work and survive. Furthermore, the issue of adultery introduced a layer of profound social humiliation and legal absurdity. A cuckolded husband was an object of public ridicule. Yet, under the law, he was still legally obligated to support his unfaithful wife. If she left him to live with another man, any debt she incurred could still be legally his. Any children she bore by her lover might, under certain legal presumptions, be considered his legitimate offspring, whom he was required to support. The wife's sale offered a pragmatic, if brutal, solution to this untenable situation. By selling his wife, often to her new lover, the husband was forcing the other man to publicly assume the responsibilities he had already taken on in private. He was formalizing the existing reality, shedding the legal and financial burdens, and restoring his own social honor by publicly casting off the source of his shame. It was a final, desperate resort to regain control over his legal and financial identity, a clean break from a union that had become a source of ruin and ridicule. If the husband's role in the wife's selling ritual was one of desperate pragmatism, the wife's role is often assumed to be one of pure, unmitigated victimhood. The iconography of the custom, the halter, the auction block, the jeering crowful picture of female subjugation. It evokes images of a terrified woman, weeping and powerless, being dragged to market and disposed of like an unwanted piece of furniture. The legal and physical power imbalance between a husband and wife in this era was absolute. A brutal or determined man could, through violence or the threat of it, compel his wife to participate in the sale against her will. In such cases, the ritual was nothing more than a public act of dominance and abandonment, the final chapter in a history of domestic tyranny. However, the historical record, as pieced together from newspaper accounts, court records, and the diaries of observers, presents a more nuanced and complex tableau. The woman at the end of the halter was not always a passive object. Her involvement existed on a spectrum, ranging from coerced victim to resigned participant, and in a surprising number of cases, to a willing and active collaborator. To overlook this spectrum is to deny these women the very agency they were so often struggling to exercise within an oppressive system. In the middle of this spectrum lies the resigned participant. This was the woman who, while finding the process deeply humiliating, recognized it as the only viable escape from an intolerable situation. For a woman trapped with a chronically alcoholic, violently abusive, or hopelessly indolent husband, the prospect of public shame at the market was the lesser of two evils. Her life within the marriage may have been a private hell of poverty, fear, and misery. The sale, in this context, was not an act of subjugation but a painful, one-time surgical procedure to remove a cancer. Her participation was a form of grim consent, an acknowledgement that the 30 minutes of degradation at the market cross was an acceptable price to pay for a lifetime of freedom from her tormentor. Contemporary reports sometimes describe women in this position as appearing sullen, tearful but not resisting, their demeanor one of stoic endurance. They were not happy about the process, but they understood and accepted its purpose. At the far end of the spectrum, and most challenging to modern sensibilities, is the wife as a willing, even eager, participant. This scenario was almost tied to the fact that the vast majority of wife sales were not speculative auctions, but pre-arranged transfers. The buyer was not a random stranger from the crowd but a man with whom the wife had already established a new relationship. He was her lover, her intended new partner, and her co-conspirator in this public act of dissolution. In these cases, the wife's sale was her only path to legitimizing this new union. The law offered her no means to divorce her husband and remarry her chosen partner. Therefore, she and her new lover would collude with the old husband to stage the sale. For the wife, this was a powerful act of self-determination, albeit one cloaked in the language of property. She was not being sold from her husband, she was being sold to the man she wanted. The husband, for his part, was often content to be rid of an unfaithful wife and the legal and financial obligations that came with her. The new partner was happy to pay a small symbolic fee to publicly and formally take her into his care, silencing local gossip and establishing their new household in the community's eyes. Numerous accounts from the period describe wives who appeared quite happy with the transaction, assisted in her own sale, or even seemed pleased with her new master. One report from the Annual Register in 1832 noted a wife, who upon being sold, turned to the buyer and kissed him, saying, "God bless you. I am yours." These were not the actions of a terrorized victim, but of a woman who was actively using the only available tool to escape one life and begin another. The degrading ritual, paradoxically, became her instrument of liberation. The identity of the individual who stepped forward to make the purchase is, perhaps, the most misunderstood element of the entire custom. The term buyer conjures images of a random spectator at a human auction, a stranger who, on a whim, decides to acquire a wife as he might a head of cattle. This sensationalized image, fueled by the most real reality of the transaction, the preponderance of historical evidence indicates that the buyer was rarely an unknown party. He was, in the vast majority of cases, a figure already intimately known to both the husband and the wife, and his participation was the predetermined final act in a carefully, if crudely, orchestrated domestic rearrangement. The most common identity of the buyer was that of the wife's existing lover or paramour. In these situations, the wife's sale was not the cause of a new union, but the public ratification of one that had already been formed in private. The affair, which had existed in the shadows of social disapproval and illegality, was brought into the open through the ritual. The buyer's motivation was not to purchase a woman, but to purchase a form of social and legal legitimacy for their relationship. By publicly buying her, he was transforming her from another man's adulterous wife into his own recognized partner in the eyes of the community. It was a public declaration of his intent to provide for her and a way to silence the gossip and censure that would have otherwise followed their cohabitation. This act of purchase also served as a crucial legal shield for the new partner. Under the civil law accessible to the wealthy, the husband could sue his wife's lover for criminal conversation and seek substantial financial damages. While such a lawsuit was beyond the means of most laborers, the threatened the principle remained. The wife's sale functioned as a form of folk legal contract that preempted any such claim. The husband, by accepting a price however nominal for his wife, was seen as having relinquished his right to any further grievance or compensation. He had been paid off. The sale was, in effect, a final settlement between the two men, with the woman as the subject of the contract. The buyer, in paying the price and taking the halter, was not just acquiring a partner. He was acquiring a public release from the legal and social status of an adulterer. In other cases, the buyer was not a lover but a man who had simply agreed to take the wife into his household. He might be a widower in need of a housekeeper and a mother for his children, or a single man seeking to establish a household of his own. In these arrangements, the sale was less about passion and more about pragmatism. A deal would be struck between the three parties beforehand. The husband would be freed of his obligations, the wife would be freed from an unhappy marriage and given a new, stable home, and the buyer would gain the domestic partner, he needed for his own economic survival. The public sale was the ceremony that made this new arrangement official and binding in the community's perception. The stranger who purchased a wife on impulse was a genuine, but exceptionally rare figure. These instances were so unusual that they were almost always the ones that became the subject of sensational newspaper articles or cautionary folk tales, which has skewed the modern perception of the custom. In these rare cases, a man might indeed hear of a sale and decide on the spot to make a bid, perhaps out of loneliness, pity, or a need for a domestic servant. But these were the outliers, the exceptions that proved the rule. The fundamental purpose of the wife sale was not to traffic women to strangers, but to provide a public and definitive mechanism for dissolving one household partnership and allowing a new, predetermined one to form with the tacit consent of the community. The buyer, therefore, was not a predator. He was the third point in the triangle, a necessary participant in a desperate solution to an impossible legal problem. While the preceding analysis has sketched the general form and function of the wife-selling custom, such generalizations can risk obscuring the human reality of the act. History, in its most granular form, is a collection of specific moments and individual lives. Fortunately, the very public nature of the custom, combined with the burgeoning local press of the 19th century, means that some of these moments were recorded with remarkable clarity. Among the most detailed and frequently cited of these is the case of Joseph Thompson, a farmer from the village of Broughton, which took place in the market square of Carlisle on Saturday, the 7th of April, 1832. This single, well-documented event serves as a perfect microcosm, containing nearly all the archetypal elements of the ritual. The day began with Joseph Thompson leading his wife, Anne, into the bustling Carlisle market. They had journeyed 3 miles to reach the town, a deliberate pilgrimage to a stage large and public enough for their purpose. Aunt Thompson was described in contemporary reports as a good-looking woman, and she was led, not by a coarse rope, but by a new halter made of straw, decorated with ribbons. This small detail suggests a degree of premeditation and perhaps even a bizarre attempt to lend a festive or ceremonial air to the grim proceedings. Upon reaching the market cross, the traditional heart of the town's civic and commercial life, Joseph Thompson did not act as his own auctioneer. Instead, he engaged the services of the local bellman or town crier, paying him a fee to officiate. This was a clear attempt to imbue the sale with a sense of formality and public authority. The bellman, ringing his bell to draw the attention of the market day crowd, made the proclamation. His words, as recorded in the Carlisle Journal, followed the classic formula. He began with the cry of Oise, Ise, and announced that Joseph Thompson was offering his wife Anne Thompson. He then proceeded with the sales pitch, enumerating Anne's qualities. He declared her to be of a good temperament character, and attested that she could read tolerably well, and write a little. He also noted her skills in domestic management, stating she could churn, make butter, and was well adapted to the domestic duties of a farmer's wife. This was not the denunciation of a shrew, but the marketing of a capable partner, suggesting the separation was not born of her specific failings, but of a more general marital breakdown. The auction then commenced. The bellman invited bids from the assembled crowd, which had reportedly swelled with curious onlookers. The bidding began at 1 shilling and quickly escalated. This element of competitive bidding is what makes the Thompson case particularly notable, as it suggests a more open, and perhaps less prearranged, transaction than was typical. Several bids were made before a man named Henry Mears, described as a pensioner from Penrith, made a final bid of 20 shillings. At this point, Joseph Thompson, apparently dissatisfied with the price, declared that he would not sell her for that sum and that he would take her home again. However, after a brief pause, Mears raised his bid substantially, offering a final price of 50 shillings or £2.10 along with an extra shilling to cover the market toll. This final offer was accepted, the money was paid, and the transfer was formalized. Joseph Thompson took the straw halter from his wife's neck and handed it to Henry Mears, thereby completing the public conveyance. The reports describe Anne Thompson as appearing quite satisfied with the exchange. She and her new partner, Mears, then left the market square and headed towards Penrith, reportedly looking as cheerful as if they had just been united in the more customary way at the church. For his part expressed his satisfaction with the outcome, stating that he was glad to be rid of her and that he believed she had got a good master. The entire event, from arrival to conclusion, was conducted in the full light of day, witnessed by hundreds, and subsequently reported as a matter of local news, leaving behind a clear and unambiguous record for future historians. To the modern observer, the wife sale custom appears almost indistinguishable from human trafficking or chattel slavery. The language of the market, selling, buying, price, auction, and the degrading symbolism of the halter all point towards the commodification of a human being. This interpretation, while emotionally resonant, fails to grasp the fundamental legal and social fiction upon which the entire ritual was constructed. The participants did not believe they were engaging in the literal sale of a person. Instead, they were performing a highly symbolic and public transfer of a set of legally binding obligations from one man to another. The woman was not the commodity. The husband's marital responsibility was. This distinction is critical. In a system of chattel slavery, the enslaved person is legally defined as property and object that can be bought, sold, bequeathed, and used at the owner's absolute discretion, with no inherent rights of their own. The wife in 18th century England, for all the limitations placed upon her by the doctrine of sever, was not a slave. She was a subject of the crown with legal rights, however circumscribed. She could not be forced into labor against her, nor could she be disposed of for profit. The wife's sale was not a commercial transaction designed to enrich the husband. As previously established, the prices were almost always nominal, a symbolic fee rather than a market valuation. The purpose was not profit, but release. The ritual at the market cross was essentially a public declaration of a new contract. The husband was the seller, and the item being sold was his set of duties as a husband, duties that the state had imposed on him for life. These duties included the responsibility to provide his wife with food, shelter, and clothing her necessaries, and crucially, the liability for any debt she incurred in acquiring them. This bundle of obligations was the property being transferred. The wife in this legal fiction was the physical vessel to which these obligations were attached. When the buyer took the halter, he was publicly declaring his willingness to assume this entire package of responsibilities. He was, in effect, telling the entire community from this moment forward, I, and not her former husband, and the man responsible for this woman's maintenance and debts. This understanding of the sale as a transfer of obligation, rather than of personhood, helps to explain many of the custom's otherwise puzzling features. It explains why the wife's consent, whether tacit or enthusiastic, was so often a key feature of the transaction. For the transfer of obligation to be successful in practice, the woman had to be a willing party to the new arrangement. If she refused to live with the buyer, the entire purpose of the sale to create a new, stable household would be defeated. This distinguishes it starkly from a slave auction, where the consent of the person being sold is entirely irrelevant. It also explains the public nature of the event. A transfer of debt and responsibility is only effective if the creditors are made aware of it. The sale served as an unequivocal public notice to every shopkeeper, public hand, and merchant in the vicinity. By witnessing the transaction, they were being formally informed that their legal recourse for the woman's future debts now lay with the new partner, not the old husband. This public notification was, for the husband, the single most important outcome of the entire procedure. The sale was a folk legal mechanism designed to achieve what the four law refused to provide, a definitive and publicly witnessed novation of the marriage contract, substituting a new party to take on the husband's duties. It was a crude, desperate, and humiliating process, but its internal logic was not one of human trafficking, it was one of contractual release. The understanding of the wife sale as a folk legal transfer of obligation was the internal logic of the participants and their immediate community. This internal perspective, however, is largely lost to history, existing only as a faint echo. The historical record of the custom, the very archive from which our knowledge is drawn, was not created by the participants themselves. It was overwhelmingly written, curated, and disseminated by an emerging and powerful new force in English society, the popular press. Consequently, the story of wife selling is inseparable from the story of how it was reported. The customs journey from a localized, private tragedy to a subject of national debate was navigated on currents of ink, carried by a tide of cheap, mass-produced newsprint that sought not to understand, but to entertain, to mock, and to sensationalize. The 18th and, more dramatically, the 19th centuries witnessed a significant expansion of provincial newspapers. Nearly every town of a respectable size began to boast its own weekly journal. These publications were hungry for content, and a wife's sale in the local market was a perfect piece of human interest copy. It was dramatic, shocking, and spoke to the fundamental themes of marriage, money, and social transgression. The tone of these reports, however, was rarely one of sociological inquiry or sympathetic understanding. More often than not, the reporting was steeped in a thick broth of class-based condescension and urban mockery of rural life. For the middle-class editors and their readership, the wife's sale was presented as an amusing spectacle, a piece of local color that confirmed their own sense of social and moral superiority. The participants were often described in terms that painted them as ignorant country yokels, their actions framed as proof of the backwardness and depravity of the laboring poor. The reports would often adopt a tone of wry amusement, dwelling on the clumsy speeches, the paltry sums of money exchanged, and the drunken aftermath, as if describing a scene from a comedic play. The deep desperation that drove a couple to the market square was entirely elided, replaced by a caricature of simple-minded rustics engaging in a bizarre and laughable ritual. The custom was not reported as a symptom of a failed legal system, but as a moral failing of the lower orders. This sensationalism was even more pronounced in another form of popular media, the broadside ballad or pamphlet. These were single sheets of paper, cheaply printed and sold on the streets for a penny or a halfpenny. They were the true crime podcasts of their day, specializing in tales of murder, executions, and strange prodigies. The wife's sale was an ideal subject. A dramatic, often rhyming, narrative would be composed, accompanied by a crude but effective woodcut illustration depicting a man leading a woman by a halter. This imagery, more than any written text, seared the custom into the popular imagination, reducing its complex social reality to a single, stark image of brutal commodification. These broad-sized were designed for maximum emotional impact and minimal nuance, cementing the popular view of wife selling as an act of monstrous cruelty rather than desperate pragmatism. The voice of the participants, especially the woman, was entirely absent from these accounts. They were the silent subjects of a story told about them, for the profit and amusement of others. While the popular press framed the wife's sale as a moral spectacle for the amusement or scandalization of its middle-class readers, the official agents of the state, at the local level, the magistrates and parish constables, were confronted with a far more practical and vexing problem. When a wife's sale was announced or in progress, they were forced to answer a question for which the law provided no clear answer: what, precisely, should be done? Their response, as recorded in judicial archives and town records, was not one of uniform condemnation or consistent prosecution. Instead, it was characterized by a profound ambivalence, a pattern of inconsistent actions that reflected the custom's ambiguous legal status and the conflicting priorities of local governance. The central difficulty for any magistrate was that wife selling, in and of itself, was not an explicitly defined crime. There was no statute in the English legal code that one could point to which stated, "It is illegal for a man to sell his wife." This legal vacuum meant that any official intervention had to be justified using other, more general offenses. The most common charge levied against a husband attempting a sale was that of creating a public nuisance, disorderly conduct, or a breach of the peace. These were charges related not to the act of selling a person, but to the disruption caused by the public gathering. The auction, the crowd, the inevitable drunkenness, and the potential for fights were seen as threats to public order, and it was on these grounds that constables were most likely to intervene and disperse the assembly. In some more legally sophisticated interventions, authorities attempted to frame the sale as a form of conspiracy. For instance, in a famous London case in 1824, the Lord Mayor intervened to stop a sale at Smithfield Market, and the parties involved were charged with conspiracy to effect a public mischief and disgracing the national character. Such charges, however, were complex to prosecute and required a level of legal resources and motivation that was rare outside of the capital. For the typical rural justice of the peace, a simple charge of disturbing the peace was a far more straightforward tool. This focus on public order, rather than the intrinsic morality of the act, reveals the magistrate's primary concern, the maintenance of a stable and peaceful community. This pragmatic focus is the key to understanding their frequent inaction. A magistrate on his bench was not just an enforcer of laws. He was the manager of a parish, acutely aware of its social tensions and, above all, its finances. A chronically feuding, destitute, or violent couple was a significant drain on the parish. They were a source of endless disputes, a potential cause of violence. And if their household collapsed entirely, they would become a direct financial burden on the parish through the poor relief system. From this starkly utilitarian perspective, a wife sale could sometimes appear not as a problem, but as a solution. If the sale resulted in the woman being rehoused with a new, stable partner who would provide for her, and the old husband was free to re-establish his own functional life, then two potential paupers had been removed from the parish rolls. A source of social instability had been neutralized. In such circumstances, a magistrate might be powerfully motivated to simply turn a blind eye. It was not uncommon for parish constables to be present at a wife's sale, not to stop it, but merely to observe and ensure the crowd remained orderly. This was not a dereliction of duty in their eyes, but a pragmatic act of community management. The official response therefore became a matter of local calculation. In one parish, a magistrate might be a stern moral reformer who would immediately dispatch constables to arrest the husband. In a neighboring parish, a more pragmatic justice of the peace might let the sale proceed, judging it to be the lesser of two evils. Over time, however, this ambivalence began to recede. The increasing centralization of the justice system and the growing influence of Victorian moral crusades exerted pressure from above. The Home Office in London began to issue directives to local authorities, expressing its disapproval of the barbarous custom and encouraging prosecution. The magistrate's bench was slowly transformed from a forum of local, pragmatic discretion into an instrument of a national project of social and moral reform, a project that had no tolerance for the messy, folk legal solutions of the poor. While local magistrates might grapple with the practice as a matter of public order or parish finance, a different and far more influential judgment was being formed in the drawing rooms, pulpits, and editorial offices of the nation's rising elite. For the upper end, more significantly, the burgeoning middle classes, the custom of wife selling was not a complex social problem to be managed. It was a moral abomination, a profound national shame, and incontrovertible proof of the deep-seated depravity of the laboring poor. Their condemnation was not rooted in a sympathetic understanding of the legal plight of the lower orders, but in the rigid and self-assured moral code of their own class, a code that was rapidly becoming the dominant cultural force in 19th century England. The ideological foundation of this condemnation was the concept of respectability. For the Victorian middle class, respectability was the paramount social virtue, a complex amalgam of financial solvency, religious piety, sober conduct, and above all, a strict adherence to prescribed gender roles and the sanctity of the private domestic sphere. The home was idealized as a sacred space, a haven in a heartless world of industrial capitalism. It was the domain of the woman, the angel in the house, whose role was to cultivate a morally pure, tranquil, and nurturing environment, shielded from the profane realities of commerce and public life. Marriage, in this view, was not an economic partnership for survival, but a sacred covenant, the bedrock of the family, the church, and the nation itself. Wife selling, in every one of its particulars, was a violent assault on this entire worldview. Its most egregious sin, in the eyes of the elite, was its publicity. The act of dragging the private, sanctified institution of marriage into the filth and chaos of a public market was an unforgivable transgression. It violated the core bourgeois distinction between the private sphere of the home and the public sphere of business, to resolve a domestic failure with a commercial transaction, especially one conducted alongside the sale of pigs and cattle, was to commit a category error of the most grotesque kind. It demonstrated to their minds that the poor lacked any conception of the sacredness of marriage or the privacy of family life. Furthermore, the very language and mechanics of the custom, the auction, The bidding, the price confirmed their deepest prejudices about the lower classes being brutish, unfeeling, unmaterialistic. The middle and upper classes increasingly framed their own marriages, at least in their public discourse, in the romantic terms of love, affection, and sentiment. They believed themselves to be motivated by refined emotions, while they saw the poor as being driven by base appetites, lust, greed, and animal instinct. The wife's sale, with its cold, transactional nature, was taken as definitive proof of this class-based distinction in sensibility. The participants were not seen as desperate people making an impossible choice, but as soulless creatures incapable of the higher feelings that supposedly defined a civilized human being. This class judgment was amplified by social reformers and religious leaders, particularly those influenced by the evangelical movement. For them, the wife sale was a symptom of a profound spiritual and moral sickness at the heart of the nation's working class. It was evidence of godlessness, licentiousness, and a complete breakdown of the Christian family. It became a powerful rhetorical to educate them in the values of thrift, sobriety, and, of course, proper Christian marriage. The custom was ripped from its context of legal necessity and reframed as a data point in a broader narrative of loyalty. This perspective was entirely devoid of empathy or sociological curiosity. The question for the elite was not, why are people forced to do this, but rather, what kind of monstrous people would do this? The answer was self-evident: a class of people fundamentally different from, and inferior to themselves. This elite condemnation, amplified by the press and the pulpit, successfully transformed the custom from a local, morally ambiguous folk practice into a national scandal that demanded suppression, not understanding. The condemnation of the wife-selling custom by the educated classes was invariably framed in the language of lawlessness. To them, it was an act of anarchy, a barbarous and savage ritual performed by a population that either did not know the law or did not respect it. This perspective, while convenient for the purposes of moral judgment, fundamentally mischaracterizes the nature of the event. The wife sale was not an act against the law, it was an act of a different, parallel law. It represented a direct and dramatic collision between two distinct and often contradictory systems of jurisprudence that coexisted in England: the formal, codified law of the state, and the unwritten, deeply ingrained folk law of the community. State law was a top-down creation. It emanated from the centres of power, from Parliament in Westminster and from the High Courts in London. It was recorded in statutes, legal treatises, and volumes of case precedents. Its authority was theoretical and absolute, applying in principle to every subject of the crown, from the highest duke to the lowliest pauper. However, as has been established, its mechanisms were accessible only to a tiny, wealthy fraction of the population. State law was a distant, alien force. It was punitive, appearing in his life in the form of the tax collector, the game warden, or the magistrate who could sentence him to transportation for poaching. But as a tool for personal redress, for solving the intractable problems of daily life like a failed marriage, it was silent, remote, and prohibitively expensive. Its concerns were property, lineage, and high politics, not the domestic miseries of the poor. In the vast space left vacant by the indifference of state law, folk law flourished. This was a bottom-up system of justice, deriving its authority not from the king or parliament, but from community consensus and time-honored tradition. It was not written in any book. It was inscribed in the collective memory of the village or the urban parish. Folk law was intensely local and pragmatic. It was not concerned with abstract legal principles but with concrete solutions that allowed the community to function smoothly. Its primary goal was the resolution of disputes, the maintenance of social harmony, and the enforcement of communal norms. Its courtroom was the village green or the market square, its jury was the assembled body of one's neighbors, and its enforcement mechanism was not the bailiff, but the powerful social sanctions of reputation, gossip, and ostracism. The wife-selling ritual was a perfect embodiment of a folk legal proceeding. It was a carefully constructed ceremony that mimicked the forms of state law, in order to create a result that the state refused to provide. The public proclamation by the husband or town crier was the equivalent of a formal legal filing, a public notice of intent. The crowd of onlookers were the essential witnesses, whose collective memory would serve as the official record of the event. The transfer of the halter was the symbolic signing unsealing of a deed of conveyance. The payment of a nominal price was the consideration, the token exchange of value that, in English contract law, was necessary to make a bargain binding. The judgment rendered in this folk court was more immediate and relevant to the participants' lives than any piece of paper from London could ever be. When the community witnessed the sale, they understood that the husband's obligations were now terminated. The local baker would know not to extend credit to the wife on the former husband's account. The neighbors would accept the wife and her new partner as a legitimate couple, allowing them to cohabit without the stigma of adultery. This social acceptance was the ruling that mattered. The authority of folklore was practical and absolute at the local level precisely because it was enforced by the very people one had to live with every day. In this context, the wife sale was not an act of ignorance or defiance of the law. It was a sophisticated, if desperate, use of an alternative legal system, one that was accessible, affordable, and, most importantly, effective in delivering a final and socially recognized resolution. It was the jurisprudence of necessity. The parallel systems of folk law and state law could only coexist in a climate of mutual, if begrudging, indifference. For much of the 18th century, the ruling elite, secure in its own legal privileges, was largely content to allow the lower orders to manage their own affairs, so long as they did not threaten property or public order in a significant way. The wife sale, while distasteful, was a localized phenomenon, a curiosity of the peasant class that posed no direct challenge to the established hierarchy. But the dawn of the 19th century heralded the arrival of a new and profoundly disruptive cultural force, the spirit of Victorian reform. This was an era animated by a powerful, almost religious belief in the idea of improvement of cities, of sanitation, of government, and most fervently, of the moral character of the nation's people. In this new climate of moral anxiety and interventionist zeal, the quiet tolerance for customs like wife selling evaporated, to be replaced by a campaign of active and organized suppression. This moral transformation was driven in large part by the evangelical revival, a powerful religious movement that swept through all levels of English society. Evangelicums emphasized personal conversion, biblical literalism, and a profound sense of social duty. It imbued its adherents, particularly within the rapidly expanding middle classes, with a restless energy to combat sin and reform society in God's image. This missionary spirit was not confined to converting heathens in distant colonies. It found its most urgent calling in the teeming, squalid, and seemingly godless slums of England's new industrial cities. The urban working class was viewed as a population adrift, cut off from the traditional moral guidance of the parish church and susceptible to the temptations of drink, vice, and social unrest. From this worldview, the wife sale was not a pragmatic folk legal solution, it was a symptom of a catastrophic moral disease. It represented a flagrant disregard for the sanctity of marriage as a holy sacrament, a public display of the very licence, senses and brutishness that reformers believed was rotting the nation from its foundation. It became a potent symbol, a single, shocking image that encapsulated everything the Victorian moralists feared and despised about the lower classes. The custom became a specific target for a new breed of organization, the Voluntary Reform Society. Groups like the Society for the Suppression of Vice, founded in 1802, acted as a form of moral police. They employed agents to seek out and prosecute public displays of immorality, from obscene publications to disorderly taverns, and a public wife auction was a prime target. The husband and buyer in a wife sale now risked not just the intervention of an ambivalent local constable, but the organized legal and social power of a national moral crusade. This pressure from private organizations was mirrored by a shift in the attitude of public officials. Magistrates and judges were increasingly drawn from, or influenced by, this same reform-minded middle class. They began to see the custom not as a harmless local eccentricity, but as a stain on the national character and a challenge to the majesty of the law. Their rulings became harsher, and their language of condemnation more severe. In an 1824 case, a judge described a wife sale as a disgrace to the country, while another in 1837 called it an offence of a most disgusting and abominable character. This changing judicial tone signaled that the state was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. The informal, unwritten rules of folklore, were being actively subordinated to the formal moral code of the ascendant Victorian establishment. The very landscape of England was also changing in a way that undermined the custom's foundations. Wife selling was a ritual that depended on the social cohesion of a small, stable community where everyone knew each other and the collective memory of the event could serve as a record. The Industrial Revolution was destroying this world. Millions were uprooted from their ancestral villages and poured into vast, anonymous cities, in the transient, chaotic environment of a Manchester or Birmingham slum. The social mechanisms of folklore broke down. A public sale in such a context lost its meaning. The witnesses were strangers. The community was a fiction. The act was stripped of its claim to folk legality out of what its critics had always claimed it was, a random, brutal, and meaningless act of public disorder. Under the harsh glare of the Victorian moral gaze, the custom began to die, not just because it was suppressed, but because the world that had given it meaning was itself vanishing. The same wave of Victorian moral anxiety that sought to suppress the customs of the poor also turned its critical gaze inward, upon the archaic and manifestly unjust institutions of the state itself. By the mid-19th century, the English system for marital dissolution, a chaotic and contradictory patchwork of ecclesiastical courts, common law actions, and private parliamentary bills, was a source of international ridicule and domestic shame. Wholly unsuited to a nation that prided itself on being the world's most modern and efficient industrial power. The mounting pressure from social reformers, legal professionals, and a public increasingly aware of the system's absurdities finally culminated in a landmark piece of legislation. In 1857, Parliament passed the Matrimonial Causes Act, a reform that did not so much alter the landscape of English divorce law as create a new one from first principles. The act was revolutionary in its core premise. It definitively stripped the ecclesiastical courts of their centuries-old jurisdiction over all matrimonial matters. The power to grant a legal separation, or divorcementa et thoro, was taken from the church and vested in a new, secular body. The act created the Court for Divorce and Matrimonial Causes, a single, centralized civil court located in London, specifically designed to handle all legal questions relating to marriage and its dissolution. For the first time, divorce was moved from the realms of scripture and legislative privilege into the domain of civil jurisprudence. An individual seeking to end a marriage would no longer petition a bishop or a member of parliament. They would present a case before a judge. This new court was empowered to grant not only judicial separations but also, and most critically, a full dissolution of marriage, the divorce of vinculo matrimony, that had previously required a private act of parliament. The astronomical costs and arcane procedures of the old system were swept away, replaced by a standardized court proceeding. However, the reform was far from a declaration of marital equality. While the act modernized the procedure of divorce, it simultaneously codified the deeply entrenched double standard regarding the grounds for it. The new law made it explicit that a husband could petition for divorce on the sole ground of his wife's adultery. A wife, however, was held to a far more demanding standard. For a wife to successfully petition for divorce, she had to prove that her husband was guilty not only of adultery, but of adultery combined with an aggravating offense. These offenses were specified in the act and included incest, bigamy, cruelty that endangered her life, or desertion for a period of 2 or more years without reasonable cause. Simple infidelity on the part of a husband was not, in the eyes of the 1857 law, sufficient grounds to dissolve a marriage. Moreover, while the new system was exponentially cheaper and more accessible than a private parliamentary bill, it was by no means cheap or accessible for the vast majority of the population. The court was in London, meaning any petitioner from the provinces would have to bear the significant cost of travel and lodging in the capital. The proceedings still required the hiring of solicitors and barristers, whose fees, though regular, remained far beyond the means of a factory worker or an agricultural laborer. The estimated cost of a simple, uncontested divorce under the new act was still around £40, an entire year's wages for many. In effect, the act had lowered the barrier to divorce from the level of the aristocracy to the level of the middle class, but it had left it well out of reach of the poor. Despite these profound limitations, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 marked the beginning of the end for the custom of wife selling. It fatally undermined the custom's foundational logic. Wife selling had existed because the state provided no viable alternative. Now, for the first time, a formal, state-sanctioned path to complete divorce existed in principle, even if it was not yet accessible in practice. The folk legal ritual of the market square was no longer the only option. As knowledge of the new law slowly filtered down through society, and as subsequent reforms in the later 19th and early 20th centuries gradually made the civil courts more affordable and geographically accessible, the customs raison d'etre began to wither. It was not a specific law against wife selling that killed the practice, but the creation of a legitimate if flawed alternative. The state had finally offered a door, and the crude, desperate act of smashing a hole in the wall was no longer necessary. The passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 was a seismic event in the English socio-legal landscape, but its tremors did not topple the ancient custom of wife selling overnight. History is not a series of switches being flipped, but a slow, grinding process of erosion and replacement. The act did not make the custom illegal, nor did it suddenly make divorce affordable for the poor. Its primary effect was more subtle, yet ultimately more corrosive. It delegitimized the folk legal alternative. The state had now, for the first time, provided an official, comprehensive answer to the question of divorce. The existence of this formal mechanism, however inaccessible, fundamentally reframed the wife sale. It was no longer a pragmatic solution in the absence of law. It was now awfully law as act in defiance of an established legal procedure. This shift in perception initiated the custom's long, slow, and terminal decline, a process that would span the next half-century. This decline was accelerated by two parallel developments that defined the mid-Victorian era: the expansion of the press and the professionalization of law enforcement. The same newspapers that had once reported on wife sales with wry amusement or sensationalism now began to report on the proceedings of the new London Divorce Court. These reports, detailing the grounds for legal separation and divorce, slowly disseminated knowledge of the new law throughout the country. A working man might not be able to afford the process, but he was now more likely to be aware that a formal process existed. This knowledge alone made the market square ritual seem less like a legitimate community custom and more like a crude and embarrassing anachronism. Compounding this effect was the rise of the new, uniformed constabulary. The old system of parish constables, often local tradesmen serving part-time, was replaced by organized, professional police forces with a mandate to enforce a more uniform standard of public order. These new policemen were less susceptible to the nuances of local custom and more inclined to view a public wife auction simply as a breach of the peace. As their presence and authority grew, even in rural areas, the staging of such a public spectacle became an increasingly risky endeavor, more likely to end with an arrest and a fine than with a successful transfer of marital obligation. The public stage for the ritual was, slowly but surely, being closed down by the agents of the state. This external pressure was mirrored by a profound internal shift in the values of the working class itself. The pervasive Victorian ideal of respectability, once the exclusive preserve of the middle class, began to filter down through society via institutions like the church, the chapel, the Sunday school, and the temperance movement. A new aspiration towards self-improvement, sobriety, and domestic propriety took root. Public shame of the wife sale became increasingly intolerable. It came to be seen not as a necessary evil but as a mark of deep personal and communal failure. A man's reputation, and that of his family, was now more closely tied to the perceived order and sanctity of his private life. To resolve a domestic crisis in the cattle market was to declare oneself beyond the pale of this new, hard-won respectability. The geography of the decline tells a clear story. The custom vanished from the cities first, where the forces of anonymity, official policing, and middle-class values were strongest. It lingered longest in the most isolated and traditional rural corners of England, in small villages where folklore still held sway and the arm of the central state was weakest. The newspaper reports of the 1872 and 1882 begin to treat the custom as a shocking relic of a bygone age, a strange survival unearthed from some forgotten pocket of the countryside. The practice was becoming a fossil, an artifact of a world that was rapidly disappearing. The final blow came not from the Grand Divorce Court in London, but from the local magistrates' bench. A series of late Victorian legislative acts, such as the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1878, empowered local magistrates to grant separation orders and maintenance payments to wives who had been subjected to cruelty or desertion. This provided a cheap, local, and most importantly, legal remedy that addressed the very problems the wife's sale was invented to solve. It offered women a path to safety and support without resorting to public degradation. The state had finally provided an accessible tool for managing marital breakdown at the lowest level of society, and in doing so, it rendered the halter and the market cross entirely obsolete. By the final decades of the 19th century, the custom of wife selling had become a ghost. For the vast majority of the English population, it was no longer a lived reality, or even a recent memory, but a curious and shameful tale from their grandparents' generation. A relic of barbarism that a modern, civilized nation had thankfully left behind. The machinery of the Victorian state, its new police forces, its increasingly accessible local courts, and its powerful ideology of domestic respectability had scoured the custom from the public square. Yet, in the deepest, most isolated pockets of rural England, in communities insulated by geography and tradition from the relentless march of progress, the ghost still occasionally walked. The last recorded sales were not the final, defiant acts of a living tradition, but the vestigial twitches of a practice long since dead, performed by individuals on the far margins of a society that had completely transformed around them. The nature of these late 19th century instances was markedly different from their antecedents a century earlier. The bravado and quasi-legal formality of the market cross auction was gone. These final acts were furtive, hushed affairs often conducted at night or in remote locations away from the newly watchful eyes of the constabulary. They were more akin to a back-alley deal than a public proclamation. When they did come to the attention of the wider world, it was usually because of a subsequent dispute that brought the parties before a magistrate. The reaction they elicited was no longer one of local ambivalence or even metropolitan mockery, it was one of universal shock and condemnation. A case from a Lincolnshire village in 1887 illustrates this shift perfectly. A farm labourer, after a violent argument, sold his wife to a neighbour for the price of a pint of ale. The transaction was conducted not in the market, but in the lane between their cottages. When the wife laid her new master and sought aid from the parish authorities, the entire affair was brought to it not as a quaint local custom, but under the headline "Disgraceful Scene in a Lincolnshire Village." The magistrate, in his ruling, did not treat it as a folk divorce. He condemned both men's ignorant conduct, fining them for disorderly behavior and breach of the peace, and he granted the woman a protection order under the new laws. The custom had been stripped of all its former folk legal authority. It was now seen for what it had become, a crude and illegal act of assault and public indecency. The community no longer recognized its legitimacy. The state now actively prosecuted it. The reasons for this stubborn persistence in the face of such overwhelming social and legal pressure are rooted in the very isolation that defined these last few cases. These were communities where literacy was still low, where newspapers were scarce, and where knowledge of the new divorce and separation laws, passed in distant London, had simply not penetrated. In these enclaves of the old ways, family disputes were still governed by a traditional, unwritten code of conduct. The idea of traveling to a town to speak to a solicitor or a magistrate was as alien as traveling to the moon. For an individual steeped in this older world, the local custom, passed down through generations, remained the only conceivable method for resolving an impossible domestic situation. These final sales were acts of profound cultural inertia, habits performed long after their original meaning and social function had been eroded. The definitive end of the custom is generally traced to a single, deeply ironic event that occurred not in a muddy village lane, but under the bright gas lights of a modern legal institution. In 1913, a woman in the industrial city of Leeds appeared before a police court magistrate, seeking a separation order from her husband. In the course of giving her testimony, she calmly informed the court that her husband had recently sold her to one of his workmates for the sum of £1. She explained had been unsatisfactory, and so she was now seeking the court's intervention. The magistrate was, by all accounts, speechless. He expressed his profound shock that such a thing could happen in this 20th century. Here, in its final, pathetic gasp, the custom had come full circle. It was no longer a public performance designed to circumvent the law, it was a private, failed arrangement being brought as evidence before the very legal system it was created to replace. The last recorded wife's sale was not an auction at the market cross, but a piece of testimony in a court rule, offered up to a representative of the state who could scarcely believe what he was hearing. The folklore had finally, and irrevocably, surrendered to the official law. The custom of wife selling now exists only as a faint and unsettling echo in the archives. It survives in the brittle, yellowed pages of provincial newspapers, in the terse entries of a magistrate's logbook, and in the sensationalized woodcuts of penny broadsides. To the modern reader, encountering these fragments is like discovering the fossilized remains of some grotesque, incomprehensible creature. The immediate instinct is to recoil, to categorize the practice as a bizarre anomaly, a singular expression of a uniquely brutal and unenlightened past. We are tempted to place it in a cabinet of historical curiosities alongside bear baiting and public executions, and congratulate ourselves on the moral distance we have traveled. But to do so is to miss the profound diagnostic value of this forgotten ritual. The wife's sale is more than a historical oddity, it is a powerful lens, a stark and unforgiving mirror that, when held up to the society that produced it, reflects the hidden structures of power, class, and justice that defined an era. What the custom reflects most clearly is the colossal failure of the English legal system to serve the vast majority of its own people. It is the definitive, material proof that in the 18th and 19th centuries, England operated a two-tiered system of justice. Law was not a public right, it was a private commodity, a luxury item accessible only to those who possessed the requisite wealth and political influence. The law was a sophisticated tool for protecting his lineage and his assets. For the man with no property, the law was a locked door, a silent and indifferent edifice. The wife's sale was the crude key that the poor fashioned for themselves to pick that lock. The halter around the woman's neck was a symbol not just of her subjugation, but of the entire laboring class's legal disenfranchisement. It was a physical manifestation of a social and judicial reality in which they were led, like beasts of burden, by forces and systems over which they had no control. The custom also strips away the romanticism that has retrospectively shrouded the history of marriage, exposing its raw, economic skeleton. For the laboring majority, the marital union was, first and foremost, a contract for survival. It was a household enterprise, a partnership of labor designed to fend off starvation and destitution. The wife's sale was the grim but logical consequence of this reality. When the partnership failed and became a liability, threatening the economic ruin of both parties, the contract had to be dissolved. The public auction, with its cold, transactional language, was not a rejection of the idea of marriage, but a desperate affirmation of its primary, practical purpose. It was a form of folk bankruptcy for a failed domestic enterprise, a necessary procedure to allow the principals to liquidate their assets and liabilities and form new, more viable ventures. Finally, the custom serves as a complex and unsettling monument to the constrained agency of the powerless. While it was undeniably an instrument of patriarchal power, it was also, paradoxically, a tool that could be wielded by women. In a world that offered them almost no legal avenues for self-determination, the wife's sale could become a collusive act of liberation. The woman who walked to the market square to be sold to her waiting lover was not a passive victim. She was an active agent in a conspiracy to achieve a freedom the state denied her. The ritual, for all its inherent degradation, provided a stage upon which she could, in concert with others, rewrite the script of her own life. It is a stark reminder that agency is not always expressed through heroic defiance, but is often found in the subtle, pragmatic manipulation of the very tools of one's own oppression. The story of wife-selling is not, therefore, the simple story of a barbaric past. It is the story of what happens when a society's formal institutions fail its people. It is the story of an invented law, a jurisprudence of last resort, born of desperation but executed with a grim and coherent logic that demands, even now, our sober and unflinching consideration. The market squares of England are quiet now. The cobblestones, once slick with mud and straw, have long been paved over. The clamour of the auctioneer, the nervous laughter of the crowd, and the low murmur of the transaction have all faded into an impenetrable silence. The halters, whether of rope or straw, have rotted into dust, and the names of the men and women who participated in these desperate rituals are now little more than obscure entries in a parish register or a fading line of newsprint. The story is sealed in the past, a strange and unsettling chapter from a distant, harsher world. But while the custom itself is a historical artifact, the forces that gave it life are not. The profound, soul-crushing weight of desperation, the feeling of being trapped in a life from which there is no formal escape, the immense chasm between the law as it is written and justice as it is experienced, these are not relics of the 18th century. They are perennial conditions of the human struggle. The need to find a pragmatic, workable solution when no ideal one exists is a constant. The rituals change, the language is modernized, and the stage is different, but the human impulse to create an informal exit when all the official doors are locked remains. The story of the wife sailor is a quiet, cautionary note about the inherent fragility of social order and the moral obligation of any legal system. It reminds us that justice is not an abstract concept, but a practical necessity, and that a system that is inaccessible to its most vulnerable is, in a very real sense, no system at all. Vulnerable is, in a very real sense, no system at all. And so that chapter of human darkness closed, but history has a habit of rhyming. Watch for the patterns in your own time. The account is now finished,